let's go back to Jim Thompson.
Okay.
Now, you worked for him. What were your impressions of him?
Well, I first, my first reaction to Thompson was when he was the U.S. Attorney, and I was one of the last co-editors of the Chicago Journalism Review, which had been the sort of alternative journalism review that came out of the '68 convention. And one of the, I did a story that there was a tidy quid pro quo relationship that had developed between the Chicago Tribune and the U.S. Attorney's Office, in which the Tribune would do investigations. They would feed the U.S. Attorney's Office, which would impanel a grand jury. The grand jury the Tribune would write the story. The grand jury would have enough time then to indict. So on the 5th day of the story, that there would be a quick, tidy payoff. So one of the great leaders of this investigative unit it came to my attention from the late great Ed Rooney from the Daily News, great reporter, that they had put a bug in this bill collection agency. And he had the bug, he had the police report, he had pictures. And so I started the process of reporting this as what's happening inside the press.
This is when you're working for the Chicago Journalism Review?
That was just a part-time job. So I was working for City News.
City News.
I was covering the federal building,
okay,
federal courts, and Thompson was the U.S. Attorney. And so I went and asked him, went face-to-face with him, and just said, okay, did you know about this? What's the nature of the relationship between you guys? And he wouldn't say anything. He was like a total stonewall. So he's all very personable and charming, as he always is and was, and he has a great manner. So inside his government, the difference was that he was, as Richard M. Daley used to be, a great incubator for creativity and going for the best, the best class. So if you came to Thompson with really a smart idea that was progressive, that was really going to move the state forward and internationally, he would let you do it. And he would withstand the heat for you as well.
So your positions with Thompson were what?
I was Assistant Director of Public Health, which was like the #2 ranking officer, and that was, he required Senate confirmation twice. And then I left there and became Deputy Director of the Department of Commerce and Department of Commerce and Community Affairs.
DECA.
DECA,
Right.
in charge of international business, economic development, tourism, and industrial safety, and film office.
So that was the moment, another turning point where you got an international dimension to your interests.
I had started really on the international side with Governor Spellman, and he was Washington State is heart and soul international, and Washington was the first sister state with a Chinese province, because Warren Magnuson and Zhou Enlai somehow had kept in contact over those 30 years. That's unbelievable. And but Thompson was very much into the Pacific Rim and Japanese relations and all this kind of stuff, and was on the Export-Import Council and was the head of the National Governors International Trade and Foreign Relations Committee. So I'd started to see the world, went to China in 1982 and Japan in 81. And so then I had been bitten by that bug, and so then was in charge of those offices. So we expanded from half a dozen to 12 offices within about 2 years, and so I was in charge of starting offices in Moscow, Toronto, Mexico City, Warsaw, and Budapest.
And do you think the Chicago business and governmental community in those days responded well to international opportunities?
No, but I think that was why it was an appropriate government role, because that there was a high level of risk, and in order to establish those fundamental relationships, the government could go and start opening those doors and start developing the relationships, particularly on the government side. So you had, you still had, the Reds were still in charge of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and that the Chinese were just backward, and the Japanese even then were just coming along. So it was, but that the thing we were learning even then was that the Asians were business was based upon relationships. So it's good to start those relationships. So those times quickly have faded, and so that's not needed anymore, really.
So you left Thompson, and then you were in private.
Right. So I went to work for Dick Dechesois, who had just started the Arlington International Racecourse after the old place had burned down. He was going to reinvent racing and reinvent the audience for racing, and so I went and became his marketing guy and ended up as vice president for marketing and TV, and so he succeeded. That he changed the audience of racing there to women, kids, and young people.
Right.
And it was a brilliant strategy.
Created a beautiful venue.
Right, and part of it was that. Part of the beauty was the marketing. So it was all marketing all the time there. So that it was like he wanted to make this a respectable place for women to go. So if women would go there, then it would be okay for Dad to go because he was the heavy bettor. And then he went after develop a youth market, and it really worked. It was smart. He was really brilliant in that.
And then you began to focus on Eastern Europe.
Well, yeah, I just somebody who had been I had been a client to in the state of Illinois, an advertising guy whom we had turned to try to open up Western Europe, to position Chicago as to the Euro elite, Western Europe, and which we successfully did. And then he was drawn in by Alex Kroll, who was the chairman of Young and Rubicam, who wanted to open up Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And so, by then the former Soviet Union. And so he hired this guy, and then he hired me to be his development director. And so, and it was the Wild East, as they called it then, and to go into, so I was in charge of development for the company through Eastern Europe, mostly reported to London, but also back to the chairman's office, because he had personal interest in Eastern Europe, being Kroll and being a Paul. And so then, but I really ended up spending most of my time on the Hungarian World's Fair that never came to pass, because that was their largest client. And the day I arrived in Budapest to live there, the next day the client came and fired the company. So then my job got to be to try to save the account. But we ended up also having to transition, is to go tell the next government when the Reds came back in power, the Social Democrats, after in the second free elections in Hungary, that you can't get there from here in terms of having a World's Fair, and you'll embarrass yourselves, and you better put this down.
Now, based in Eastern Europe, what were people's thoughts, connections, images regarding Chicago?
It depended. I mean, they were sort of more favorable than you would expect. I mean, the Czechs, for one, had a long history in Chicago. So family connections, and the Chicago Czech is even its own sort of dialect. I was actually taught Czech in the Army, of all things. And the Hungarians didn't have that much of an image. They're a great sort of base was both New York, New Jersey, and Cleveland, and so they were more aware of that, those kind of things. From my point of view, we had like Cardinal Mindszenty was my closest link, because when we had said our prayers every night around my mother's bed, and every night we'd pray for Cardinal Mindszenty, and I don't know, okay, who's this guy? And so he was the one that was who had spent his final days in the U.S. Embassy in Hungary, in Budapest.
It's actually years, wasn't it?
Years. He was there for years. Yeah, I was there for years, and so it was kind of strange because when I went there, met with the United States ambassador in that room where Mindszenty had spent all those years, and it was just like it was very strange to be there. So, but there was. They knew Chicago, but they didn't know it very well.
Then you came back to Chicago, and eventually you were with World Business Chicago.
Right.
And tell us, that was a very major assignment in your career.
It was great. It turned out great. I got a call from somebody I knew I was related to by divorce in City Hall, who was the deputy chief of staff for the mayor, and said, "Would you be interested in, starting up economic development organization for the city?" And I said, "Well, sure," but I realized my dad had been a famous critic of the mayor. My mentor had been a famous critic of the mayor. I had worked for 2 Republicans. This was not like a very likely. So I sent him the resume. So next thing I know, I'm there with Forrest Claypool, who's the chief of staff at the time, and like, we're going to do this right away, and blah, 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 and would you do this, and how would you do this, what would you do, and all this kind of stuff, and how much money do you want, all these kind of things. So I said, okay, well, it sounds good, let's go do it. And so then, nothing. So it went like, not a peep, not anything. And so I went back about my business again, and like 7 or 8 months later, phone rang again as the same deputy chief of staff, and his first question was, "Well, how mad are you?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, nobody's talking to you." I said, "No, I'm fine, I don't care." And I've gone on with my life. So then they said, "Okay, the mayor wants to talk to you." So he had a new chief of staff, which is Julius Stash. So I went in with Stash, and we hit it off fine. And then I said, "But the issue is going to be the mayor. If you don't have chemistry with the mayor, it's not going to happen." So I went in with the mayor and actually had, probably the best conversation I ever had with him, and it was also the best. It was because I just laid out to him, like, do I have to hire Democrats? Do I have to hire patronage? Do I have to hire from intergovernmental affairs? All this kind of stuff. I wanted to know what the scoop was. He said, no, just hire all the best people, and just find the best people you can, all this kind of stuff. Fine. So of course, within weeks, they started sending me goofs, and they weren't qualified, so I didn't hire them. I had anything against if they were okay there. I didn't have a problem with them, but I just didn't do them, and then I didn't hire them, and they didn't like it, but they didn't punish me too much.